history is the lie everybody agrees upon. It's a fair statement. Most of history is revisionism in the way it's presented. It gets rewritten according to what is politically convenient at the time. So it becomes almost something mythologized that people accept. And I've seen this various times around the world. I was in Northern Ireland a few weeks ago. The average person in Northern Ireland, Catholic or Protestant, does not know how the so-called dreaded English first arrived in Ireland. Well, Henry II, who was a Norman, he wasn't even English, was threatened by Pope Adrian IV, if he didn't invade Ireland, to put an end to what remained of Celtic Christianity, that he would excommunicate him. How did the English get involved in Ireland? The Pope sent them. William of Orange, his wife, was a Catholic. The Pope blessed him for victory at the Battle of the Boyne and celebrated his victory over James. People have no sense of this. They have no sense about what really happened. It just becomes Protestant, Catholic, orange, green. Tell the lie often enough and people will think it's the truth. People tell a lie. I go to Northern Ireland and the hatred that I've seen in the bigotry. But it's based on revisionism. The founders of Irish republicanism, Charles Parnell was a Protestant. Nefertandi was a Protestant. Jonathan Swift was a Protestant. Wolfe Tone, they were all Protestants. The Catholic Church never cared about the Irish people. Yet try to tell that to an Orangeman or to a Catholic. And that's in Britain. The hatred runs back centuries in Ireland. But it runs back thousands of years to what happened in the womb of Rebecca between Jew and Arab. The Middle East is Ireland to the 10th power. And I choose the Irish and Jewish because my own family's a mixture of Irish and Jewish. But it's the same thing. Tell the lie often enough and people will think it's the truth. History is the lie everybody agrees on. Goebbels knew it. Just tell the lie often enough and people will think it's the truth. They'll accept it. Look how people accept Darwinism. Even though its fundamental premises cannot be defended in academic debate among scientists. There are fundamental questions Darwinists can't answer and admit they can't answer. Things that they fundamentally admit they can't answer but they tell the lie often enough, people will think it is the truth. Tell the lie. We live in an age where the media is propounding a lie, where academics, usually of a left-wing orientation, are telling a lie, but also where churches, including in some cases evangelical churches, and their theologians, scholars, are telling a lie. Even though they may subscribe to the lie themselves, they may honestly believe the lie, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are all liars if they believe the lie, but they bought into the lie and they believed it. Just because somebody believes a lie doesn't mean it's true. There are three things that are natural bedfellows and work in harmony. You can juxtapose them. One is replacement theology, the idea that God is finished with Israel and the Jews. The church has replaced Israel to the negation of any prophetic purpose for Israel and the Jews. That is one lie. Second lie is anti-Zionism. The Jews have no right to be in the land of Israel as an independent nation. And the third is antisemitism, that there's something inherently sinister about Jews, when in fact the scriptures make it clear that the Jews are simply a microcosm of the human condition. If God had chosen anybody else, they would have done the same thing Israel did. God simply uses Israel as an object lesson to teach about the nature of fallen man. We are all stiff-necked. We are all rebels. Christianity has rejected the truth of the New Testament just as much as Talmudic Judaism has rejected the truth of the Tanakh. There are those who would say that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. And it's only fundamentalist Christians from America who try to say it is in Christian circles. And they say that Zionism is apartheid. I'd like to quote a Baptist minister from the United States. He knew a great deal about apartheid, or its American version was the same thing, segregation. Now, I remember this as a kid in the States, driving to Florida with my parents. This is Klan country, white only. I actually remember that stuff in the American South. We didn't have it in New York or New Jersey, where I was from, but it did exist in the South. And I remember what it was like. I remember what it was like. Well, there was this one Baptist minister from the American South, and he said, and he wrote, "Be not deceived. Anti-Zionism is but anti-Semitism." His name was Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. That's what he said. And that's what he wrote. That's what he believed. If anybody knew what racism and apartheid was, it was him. But he knew what anti-Semitism was. He knew what anti-Zionism was. When I see so-called evangelical scholars going off about Israel, they're inevitably the proponents of replacement theology. Now, when liberals do that, I expect it because liberal theologians are not Christians anyway, except culturally and in name. They are not in any spiritual or doctrinally valid sense real Christians. They're not regenerate. But when you see people who profess to be born again saying nonsense, it all comes down to their presuppositions and their impeccable packaging. One is an Anglican bishop who's a scholar, former bishop. His name is Nigel Wright. He has absolutely perfect Oxbridge English. And he is a credible scholar in terms of his knowledge of Sitzemleben, usually. I've heard him make mistakes, but he understands the cultural background of the scriptures quite well. Yet when he deals with Israel, and he deals with Zionism, it's all presuppositional. He doesn't even deal, essentially, in Romans 9, 10, and 11. The heart of the New Testament's teaching about the relationship between Israel and the church, he doesn't even deal with it. He circumvents the heart of the New Testament teaching on the issue. And he makes assumptions. The Israel of God in Galatians is the church. On what exegetical basis? The Israel of God is the faithful remnant of Israel who believes at this particular time that Jesus is the Messiah, into which non-Jews are engrafted. But he just states it as if it were a fait accompli without lending any exegetical support to his presupposition. It's presuppositional. You just say it presuppositionally so people will accept it as a fact. The late John Stott was another one. Stephen Sizer, of course, we won't even go there. He was to debate me on television and he backed down. He did debate Calvin Smith, but not very successfully. If you look at these people, what happens? It's amazing. When you engage in the issue, they can't argue theologically or doctrinally or exegetically. They always resort to two things: political polemics and religiosity. They give emotionally charged speeches about brotherhood and love instead of dealing with the factual issues. Or they turn it into a political dialogue instead of dealing with what the scriptures actually say about Israel prophetically. They can't contend, so they get religious. Or they shift what should be a theological debate into a political one. Not that they're very good at that one either. I've pointed out many times, when you see a preacher or a theologian or a Christian author or scholar of any description, even professing to be evangelical, if they are wrong about Israel, I guarantee you they are wrong in some of their other doctrine. Now, being right about Israel is not a litmus test of somebody being kosher. I guarantee it. Now, being right about Israel does not prove somebody's kosher. There are plenty of people who understand, and we've all seen them, and we know many of them. You know them, who understand that God has a prophetic purpose for Israel and the Jews, but they've got Gentiles going under the law. The Messianic movement has been invaded by Meshuggahs who are trying to live under two covenants, like the Seventh-day Adventists. Putting even non-Jews into bondage to even rabbinic tradition. Being right about Israel doesn't prove somebody's kosher. However, if they're wrong about Israel, I guarantee you they're not kosher. They're wrong in their other doctrine somewhere. I've never known anyone who was into replacement theology who was not fundamentally off in their other doctrine. Take a famous case like John Stott. He went down the ecumenical road. Then he went down the annihilation road. We can't tell people there's a hell. If you die, you'll be annihilated. You won't exist anymore. That's what unsaved people think anyway. You'll always find if they're wrong about Israel, they're wrong about something else. I've never encountered a single exception. My own view, most of you know, and not only my own, but my own view is that most of what we call Christianity is Christendom. It is patristic. It comes from the church fathers, not directly from the New Testament. And most of what we call Judaism is not scriptural. It is not Mosaic. It is Talmudic. So what you have is a corruption of Judaism and a corruption of Christianity. One claiming to be something it isn't, and the other claiming to be something it isn't. The Judaism of the rabbis, it is my contention, is not scriptural Judaism. There's no such thing as a rabbi in the Old Testament. You won't find the term. It means great one. There was no rabbi. There was Levites. There were Kohanim. But there was no rabbis. There was no synagogue. There was no Bet Knesset. There was a Bet Mikdash. It is a very different religion. Scriptural Judaism has not existed since 70 AD. It's not been possible to practice it. Judaism was invented by people like Yochanan ben Zakkai and Rabbi Akiva. It was developed by the Gaonim. Basically, it came from Babylon with the Babylonian Talmud. All false religion comes from Babylon, including much of what we call Christendom. You won't find the rabbi any more than you'll find the Pope or purgatory. It's just not in that. People invented this stuff. But my argument tonight is not with people who've changed Judaism or who've changed Christianity. It's with those who deny the prophetic purposes of God for Israel and the Jews. Understand, my disagreement with Talmudic Judaism in no way offsets or influences my agreement with the right of the nation Israel to exist in its biblical homeland. The two are not mutually exclusive. As I was talking to somebody today, let us remember something. Jews are very defensive about anti-Semitism, and understandably so. They have good reason to be based on their history. But if the rabbis had had their way, there would be no Israel. The rabbis were almost uniform in their condemnation of Theodor Herzl and the Zionist movement. God had to use secular Jews who came out of the Ashkelon, Jewish socialists, to reestablish the nation Israel. He didn't use the religious. The religious condemned it. It wasn't until the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s that religious Zionism really took heavy root in Israel. My question would be then, if the rabbis are indeed the true shepherds of Israel spiritually, how come God had to use Jewish atheists and Jewish agnostics and Jews who are irreligious to reestablish the Jewish state, or I would ask another question. Of the 45 or 50 countries in the world professing to be democratic, a liberal rabbi, a reform rabbi, a messianic rabbi, a conservative rabbi can be a rabbi in Australia, in Canada, in France, in Argentina, in Brazil, in the USA. They can be a rabbi anywhere. But there's one country claiming to be a democracy where Jews are denied freedom of religion. That is Israel. Only an Orthodox rabbi can so much as legally perform a wedding or a burial. The one nation claiming to be a democracy that denies Jews freedom of religion is Israel. Don't confuse the two. Support of Israel and the Jewish people does not equate to support of Talmudic Judaism. Once again, if the rabbis had their way, there would be no Israel. They condemned Ben-Gurion, they condemned Herzl, they condemned Zionism. Let's just talk about Israel. The first opponents of Zionism were not Christian, neither were they Muslim. The first opponents of Zionism were Orthodox Jews and liberal Jews. They call their synagogues temples, testifying to the fact that they don't believe the real temple would ever be rebuilt in Jerusalem. So anti-Zionism did not begin with Christians or people claiming to be Christians. Neither did it begin, strictly speaking, with Muslims. Anti-Zionism in the modern sense began with professing Jews. It began with rabbis. It began with Orthodox Jewish people. That's an irony in itself. It's an irony in itself. Nonetheless, let's continue. You know, much of the opposition coming from the media can be understood politically. It's to do with the oil lobby and with the banking establishment that recycles petrodollars through the City of London. Much of it can be simply explained by the power of the purse. We are expected to buy into an obvious myth that nobody in their right mind believes. They are not asked a question that's obvious. Again, there are approximately 52 nations in the world that are Islamic. And when you ask the question, show me one, just one of these 52 nations that will give Jews and Christians the freedom that Israel and the Western democracies give Muslims, they can't show you one. They can't even show you one! But the media just conveniently ignores that. You're expected to ignore the unignorable and not ask the obvious question. That doesn't fit the narrative. It's always about the narrative, not about the facts. There's a narrative. This is what we're going to believe. This is the party line. This is what communism was based on, Sovietism. It's Vestia and Pravda. Truth was not the fact. Truth was what the Politburo said it was. Factual reality was irrelevant. It's the narrative. We are being fed a narrative, force-fed it. Much of this comes from academic institutions. What they won't tell you, of course, is the funding of universities and academic institutions from the Persian Gulf. Well, let's talk about these academic institutions who are increasingly anti-Israel. There are exceptions. There are exceptions. But anybody in the real world of business or the professions knows something. As a rule of thumb, as a generalization, those who can't do, teach. There are exceptions. If you're no good in court, become a law professor. If you're no good on Wall Street or the City of London, become an economics professor at LSE. And if you're no good in the pulpit, teach in a seminary. Those who can't do, teach. Are there exceptions? Yes. Now, I'm only speaking in non-scientific fields. In scientific fields, it's not true. to the same degree. These are people who are academics. They're detached from the real world. They couldn't make a living in the real world. They would not have the ability to be competitive in a marketplace. So they went to academia. Fact is ignored. Fact is ignored. What I'd like to do now is simply equip Christians how to respond to the basic objections we continually hear proposed as if they were factually true. How do we respond to this narrative we're continually getting? We get it from academic institutions, we get it from the media, we get it from left-wing politicians, but we're increasingly getting it from the church, the Presbyterians, the Church of Scotland, the World Council of Churches, and even evangelicals in some cases. How do we respond? The litany of myth. Let's just call this the litany of myth. First myth. The restoration of Israel is not taught in the New Testament. You are simply taking it from the Old Testament as if the Old Testament, the Tanakh, is not the Word of God. Myth 1. Zionism not in the New Testament. Turn with me, please, to the Gospel of St. Luke, chapter 21, verse 24. Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Gentiles eknon, until, plethero. A time would come when the time of the Gentiles would end, and it would have something to do with the Jews not only being in the land, but being specifically in Israel. Now there are related terms found in Romans 11 and in the book of Revelation and the prophet Daniel. But Jesus said directly, a time would come when the Jews would have to be nationally restored to Jerusalem. As we looked at this morning, Jerusalem is where Satan got his biggest defeat, and it is where he will get his final one. Look with me to the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 23. Remember, people inserted the chapters, not God. They're not in the original text. But when we read it in context, the preface, as it were, the prelude or the preface to Matthew's version of the Olivet Discourse begins in chapter 23 of Matthew. Verse 37, Jesus is weeping over Jerusalem. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather you and gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you are unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. He's echoing the prophecies of Daniel chapter 9. The Messiah would come and die before the second temple would be destroyed. Mashiach yitzterek ravova lamut lifnei ha'orban shel beit hamikdash hashemit. Your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on, you shall not see me, plethero, until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Baruch haba b'shem Adonai. If you're a Catholic, benedictum qui veni in nomine Dominum. That's what it says. He's weeping over Jerusalem. The Jews would have to be in Jerusalem for him to return. There are passages in the New Testament that would have to be spiritualized out of context to negate their literal meaning. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, among them Revelation 11 being another. But plainly, Jesus made it clear the Jews would have to be back, and that's without going to the Old Testament. It's without going to the Tanakh. Clearly and plainly, Jesus said it. Why do I never hear replacement people dealing with these prophecies? The very words of Jesus. Why don't I hear them addressing it? Why is it always ignored, circumvented, discounted? Why doesn't it feature in their treatment of the scripture. It is a myth. It is the first myth that it's only something taught in the Old Testament, not the New. Show them Luke 21:24. Show them Matthew 23. After you do that, then you can go to things like 2 Thessalonians 2. It's a myth. First myth. First myth. What's the next myth? That the Jews took a Palestinian land. Palestine is, of course, simply the Latinization of Philistine, a 2nd century term invented by the Romans. As I pointed out before, Philistines were not an Arab people ethnically. They were an Indo-European people, Grecian. They were like from Crete, places like that. They worshipped the fish god Dagon. Every anthropologist knows this. Everyone. A Philistine has not existed in more than 2,600 years. An ethnic Palestinian has not walked the earth in 2,600 years plus. And when they did, they were not Arabs. They were Greeks. But the tooth fairy came with the magic wand. Under the advice of the Soviets during the Cold War pre-1967, the Soviets began giving this name and identity to the Arabs who lived in Gaza, who were kept in subhuman poverty by Nasser and the Egyptian government. The Arabs in the West Bank were Jordanians. To this day, even the Arabs in the East Bank, in the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, 7 out of 10 are Palestinian Arabs. Only 30% are Bedouin. They went to bed one night in the early 1970s as Jordanians. But the tooth fairy flew out the window of the United Nations in my native New York, came across the Atlantic, then across the Mediterranean, and the tooth fairy waved the magic wand. And there was a great metamorphosis. People who went to bed as Jordanians woke up, and all of a sudden they were now Palestinian. It's amazing what you can do with the magic wand. Politicians lie. Editorialists lie. Left-wing academics lie, and even theologians lie. Archaeology just gives you facts. You know what a tell is, multiple strata inside an archaeological dig. You go back, strata by strata by strata, century by century by century, and some of these have dozens of strata. You can go to a tell like Tel Megiddo, 17 major strata. You can find in these strata and the tells Byzantine ruins, Crusader ruins, Ottoman Turkish ruins, Roman ruins. But no matter how far you go back, the original one is always Jewish ruins. And we know from the scriptures that Abraham was in the land from the time of the Canaanite. They're the indigenous people. Who says so? The Judeo-Christian scriptures? No! Archaeology says so. The obvious question I always ask. No, I do not object to Hispanic Americans living in Arizona, or to Asian Americans, or to Afro-Americans, or European Americans living in Arizona. They can all live in Arizona if they want to, as far as I'm concerned. But don't tell me an Apache is an occupying presence. An Apache cannot occupy Arizona. An Irishman cannot occupy County Tipperary. A Maori cannot occupy New Zealand. An Eskimo cannot occupy Greenland. Why? Because they are indigenous. By definition, an indigenous people cannot be considered an occupying presence unless they are a Jew. It doesn't make sense, does it? And we're supposed to believe it's non-biased? How can an indigenous people be called an occupying presence? The occupation of somebody else's land? Second myth. The indigenous are occupiers. If they're indigenous, they cannot possibly be occupiers. But you're supposed to suspend all critical faculties, divorce yourself from reality, and listen to the left-wing academics. You know, those who can't do, so they teach. But let's continue further. What you have done, what the Israelis have done, what the Jews have done, backed by America and the West, to the poor Palestinian people. The United Nations is no friend of Israel. But an agency of the United Nations is the World Health Organization. They say, not me, they say, in terms of everything from infant mortality to unemployment to longevity, the standard of living of Arabs in the West Bank increased 320% under the Israelis as compared to what it had been under the Jordanians. In Gaza, before Hamas took over and the Israelis left, it increased 370%. We're not talking about a second car or a platinum credit card or a convertible. We're talking about infant mortality, longevity, education, employment, the essentials of life. The poverty and suffering of the Palestinian people because of these Zionists. Tell the lie often enough and people will think it's the truth. Yeah. Well, let's see what has caused the poverty in Gaza. After the Israelis left, the Palestinian Authority, Yasser Arafat's crowd, pilfered and looted the international aid given by America, Britain, and Europe. They looted it, they embezzled it. They stole most of the money designed to build an infrastructure. That is why the people turned to Hamas. But then Hamas pilfered and extorted the aid to build bunkers and fashion military apparatus to be used against the Israelis. It is their own corruption that reintroduced poverty to Gaza and the West Bank. Under the Israelis, the poverty decreased radically and drastically. Unemployment went down. Infant mortality went down. Longevity increased. Third myth, the Zionists caused the poverty. No, according to the World Health Organization, the Zionists alleviated the poverty. And had it not been for the radicals within the Islamic communities, it would have increased even further. Fourth myth. Land for peace. The two-state solution. This is my personal favorite. There were Jewish communities in Gaza and the West Bank up until the 1920s. They were destroyed in Islamic pogroms. The so-called settlements are essentially the re-establishment and reconstruction of Jewish communities that had always been there that were destroyed in jihads. But that's not the main point. Before the House of Saud came to power in the jihad in Saudi Arabia, King Musharraf of Saudi Arabia said, then called just Arabia, Israel is for the Jews. Before the Ba'ath Party deposed the monarchy in Iraq, King Faisal II of Iraq said, Israel is for the Jews. A two-state solution. There is and has always been a two-state solution. The League of Nations said, we're going to give this to the Zionists. The rest will be for the Arabs. In 1948, the United Nations said there's a two-state solution. Although the Israelis only got 21% of what was promised to them by the British and by the League of Nations, they took it for the sake of peace and to have something. But now let's fast forward a bit to the later 20th century. In 1968, King Hussein of Jordan, who I met when I was 15 years old in Virginia, the father of the present King Abdullah, who saw his own grandfather, King Abdullah I, assassinated by the Mufti's men in the Mosque of Aqsa on the Temple Mount on the Har HaBayit. He said, Jordan is Palestine. In 1968, before Black September, Yasser Arafat said, Palestine is Jordan. There is a Palestinian Arab Muslim state. Who said so? Yasser Arafat. The government of Jordan. Her Majesty's government, the British government, the League of Nations, the United Nations. They all said there is a Palestinian Arab Muslim state. They all said there's a two-state solution. Now they want a two-state solution. They've always had a two-state solution. But they don't want a two-state solution. You've got a Hamas government in Gaza, and you have a Palestinian Authority government in the West Bank. So now you have a 1, 2, 3, 4-state solution. They want a second and a third Palestinian Muslim state. But that's not enough either. They want a law of return, allowing Arabs of Palestinian descent, as they call it, to return not to the West Bank or to Gaza, but to Israel proper. They want a 5-state solution. In other words, they want all of it. It is a lie. You want a 2-state solution? You have one. You've always had one. What are you even talking about? The British government said you have one. The UN said you have one. The League of Nations said you have one. The Jordanians said you have one. Arafat said you have one. Only when Arafat tried on the Jordanians what he tried on the Israelis. The British trained and equipped Jordanian legion, massacred between 15 and 18,000 of Arafat's followers in 12 days in Black September 1970. The Jordanians knew what Arafat was. They massacred them. A lie everybody agrees on. Well, let's continue even further. Land for peace! Twice Israel was forced to go into southern Lebanon against its will to stop Katyusha rockets from falling on Galilee, from hitting Nahariya and Metula and Kiryat Shmona and Carmiel and then Haifa. Under international pressure, both times the Israelis left southern Lebanon only to have to go back again. Oh, they left Gaza unilaterally. They left it. Uprooted any Jews who lived there. The next day, Katyushas were fired at Sderot in the suburbs of Tel Aviv. When Muslims talk to the Western press, they say they want peace. Salim. When they talk to each other, they say they want hudna. The Islamic doctrine of tahweed, permissible lying. You are allowed to say you believe in peace when you believe in war because they don't see it as a lie. They see it as military disinformation against the infidel. It is when Muhammad made a strategic withdrawal, as they put it, to Medina from Mecca until he got the upper hand. Then he returned to Mecca and wiped everybody out who got in his way. That is their definition of peace. We want peace. That's 5. Land for peace. Let's face realities. From May of 1948 until June of 1967, more than 19 years. Not only the Golan Heights, put that to one side. East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza were all in the hands of Arab Muslims. If they wanted another Palestinian Arab Muslim state, in addition to the one that they said they already had in Jordan, why didn't they simply establish one when they had nearly 20 years to do so? Nobody would have stopped them. They had nearly 20 years to make another Palestinian Arab Muslim state. 20 years? But they saw no need for it until they lost the wars. The lie everybody agrees on. It's not about Salim. It's about Hudna. It's the Islamic doctrine of Tahweed. That divides the whole world into 2 camps, the Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb. You know what they say in their rallies when they bury terrorists and turn them into political rallies, war cry? First the Saturday people, then the Sunday people. First we're going to murder the Jews, then we're going to murder the Christians. Well, let's continue looking at this. Let us be honest and realistic. First the Saturday people, then the Sunday people. The human rights abuses. I debated whether to do this, to bring it in on my iPad for a PowerPoint. Some of the pictures are too ugly with the children being beheaded. Christian children being beheaded. You want to see human rights abuses? Look what the Muslims do to each other. They've got a problem. Their problem, of course, is the doctrine of Ummah, which erroneously teaches in a surah in the Quran that Muslims are one nation and one people. Of course, the scriptures tell us something different. The scriptures tell us They are not one nation and one people. Ishmael's seed will always be divided, and Esau's sword is against his brother. Until they accept Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus, they will always be divided. Islam requires a common enemy because it's the only basis of unity. Look what ISIS is doing. The hatred between Sunni and Shia, and between Shia and Shia, and Sunni and Sunni. It's unbelievable. They need a common enemy or they will kill each other. It's their only basis of unity. That's how they want peace. They want peace among themselves. They need a common enemy. Otherwise, there will be no peace among themselves. There never has been. What Saddam Hussein did to Kuwait, what happened between northern and southern Yemen. Most jihads in the world have always been and remain Muslims killing other Muslims. Would you look to the genocide of Christians in Darfur and Sudan, and nobody said a word? Would you look what's happening in northern Nigeria? Nobody's saying anything hardly. With Boko Haram. Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines. Oh, this is the next myth. Zionism provokes radicalism. You realize at the present time in history, the early 21st century, there are more than 3 times as many conflicts involving Islam in the world, including Muslim against Muslim conflict, than there are all of the other religio people groups put together? If Israel didn't exist, if there was no Israel, we would still have over 300,000 dead Christians in East Timor. We would still have over 90,000 dead Christians in the southern Philippines. We would still have 3.4 million dead Christians in Sudan and Darfur. We would still have at least 1.3 million dead Christians in northern Nigeria. If Israel didn't exist, we would still have what happened in Beslan, Russia, what happened in Mumbai, India. We would still have September 11th. We would still have the London tube attacks. We would still have. Everybody who knows anything really knows the only thing Israel is guilty of is what every civilized nation should be guilty of, standing up to them. It does not provoke radicalism. It defends itself from radicalism. Next myth. These Zionists, who were not a religious movement, and you premillennial Christians who support it, you're trying to force your religious views on other people. Leave faith out of the political arena. Just deal with the historical and legal issues. Let's do that. Arab Muslims are not indigenous. The archaeological record testifies to that. Most people who call themselves Palestinian Arabs are the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of people who immigrated illegally under the British, coming for a better standard of living than existed in most Muslim countries because of the British mandate and because of Zionism. Most of the land was either desert or swamp. The Jews did not expropriate private land. In 1948, the Israelis pled for peace. The United Arab Command told those people to leave and will push the Zionists into the sea, then go back. So they left. But the Zionists pushed them into the sea. Now they want to come back. Sorry, you checked out. We've reserved your room for another guest. That's what happened. Of course, the Jewish refugees who came from Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Iraq, that doesn't factor into the equation either. Israel absorbed all those Jews. A significant cost economically, but they absorbed them. The Islamic world, with its doctrine of Ummah, kept these people in refugee camps. After telling them to leave, They put them in refugee camps and kept them there for generations. Oh, they're in refugee camps because of the Israelis. The overwhelming mass of Palestinian Arabs in refugee camps in countries like Lebanon particularly did not flee Israel. They fled Jordan with Black September. King Hussein drove tens of thousands of them out of the country. They came from Jordan. Whose fault is it that Arafat tried to take over Jordan and the Jordanians kicked his teeth down his throat and drove his followers out? It's the fault of the Israelis. The lie everybody agrees on. You try to force your views. You try to force your religious views on others. Your scriptures say that. You try to force your religious convictions, they say. Yes, the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament say the Jews would go back to that land. That is clear. But even if it didn't, the archaeological record says they are indigenous. The legal and historical record says the land was partitioned legally. It was not expropriated. What they have, they were forced to conquer in self-defense. It's not Israel or the Christians who support Israel who have to make the claim based on Scripture. Islam's only claim is Dar el-Islam and Dar el-Harb. They teach that once Muslims conquer a land, Allah has given it to them, and it's part of Dar al-Islam. It's theirs by divine right from their God, Allah. It's Islam that demands you accept the teachings of its religion. It has no historical basis for its claims. It's Islam that demands you pander to their beliefs. The same as here, demanding that Tesco sell halal meat. It's Islam that makes those demands. It's not Judaism or Christianity. Tell the lie often enough, people will think it's the truth. But what's really happening? And why is it happening? Why is such an obvious series of myths allowed to be propagated as if it had some factual basis, when it has no basis in fact? Why is it accepted? It wouldn't stand up to any standard of academic or legal scrutiny. It's as bogus as Darwinism. It's a nonsense argument. Well, let's see what's really happening. But more importantly, let's look at what's going to happen. Turn with me, please, to Zechariah. Who was really responsible for this mess? Is it the Zionists? Is it the Muslims? Is it the devil? Who is responsible for this mess? Zechariah 12:10 tells us, the burden of the word of the Lord concerning Israel. Thus declares the Lord, who stretches out the heavens, who lays the foundations of the earth and forms the spirit of man within him. Behold, I am going to make Jerusalem a cup that causes reeling to all the people around. And when the siege is against Jerusalem, it'll also be against Judah. Now the one who's causing this is not primarily the devil, although he has a hand in it. No, it is not Islam or the Arab nations, although they have a hand in it. At least they are stooges in the scenario. And no, it is not the Zionists or the Jews or the Christians who support them. The Lord is going to make Jerusalem a heavy burden. This is God dealing with the children of Abraham, both Jew and Arab. As I've said repeatedly for many years, through Abraham, all the peoples of the earth would be blessed through his seed. The Messiah would come. you would think that the first nations to embrace the gospel, the promise to Abraham, would be Jew and Arab. Of all the nations in the world, who are the two most difficult to see come to faith in the promise to Abraham? Jew and Arab. I see Asians here, I see Africans here, I see Anglo-Saxons and Celts. A few Jews who believe by the grace of God. Maybe there's one or two Arab brethren I have not met, I don't know. But the descendants of Abraham are in the conspicuous minority, aren't they? Eskimos believe, Koreans believe that you go to Seoul, Korean is a huge church with a massive steeple and a gargantuan choir. Every other street looks like Alabama. Churches are growing like wildfire in Africa, the Philippines, Latin America, areas of Asia. What's the problem with Abraham's children, the Jews and Arabs? Why won't they believe? The Lord is causing Jerusalem. All who lift it will hurt themselves grievously. Once again, it is where Satan got his biggest defeat, and it is where he will get his final one. Verse 3, I will make Jerusalem a heavy stone for all people. All who lift it will be critically injured. The nations of the earth will gather against it. How many UN resolutions passed against China for Tiananmen Square? 1.3 billion people have watched it to date on TV and on the internet. 1.3 billion people have seen Tiananmen Square, and it is the official position of the Chinese government in Beijing that it didn't happen. How many UN resolutions passed against China for Tiananmen Square? None. All the nations of the earth will gather against it. And that day, declares the Lord, I will strike. Oh boy. Well, we know what it's coming to. We know what it's coming to. Verse 7, the Lord also will save the tents of Judah first, in order that the glory of the house of David, and Bet David, and the glory of the inhabitants of Jerusalem may not be magnified above Judah. And that day the Lord will defend the inhabitants of Jerusalem. The one who is feeble among them in that day will be like David, and the house of David will be like God, like the angel of the Lord before them. An Old Testament victory of apocalyptic proportions. And that day it'll come about, I will set to destroy all the nations that come against Jerusalem, and anybody who lifts it will be hurt grievously. What will happen in that day, as you continue to read Zechariah, a lot of things happen before it. Things have always happened to the Jews in thirds. Remember, not a hair of your head will perish, but Ezekiel had to shave his head. 1/3 of the hairs from his head he had to burn with fire. 1/3 he had to chop up with a sword, and 1/3 scattered to the breeze. He took a few hairs and tied them into the fringe of his garment. What does a Jew have in the fringe of their garment? Tzitzit. The remnants who kept the word of God kept them. What happened to the rest? 1/3 were killed by the sword with the Babylonian invasions. 1/3 were asphyxiated when Jerusalem was burned, and 1/3 was scattered to the diaspora. In the 1930s and 40s, 2/3 of European Jewry, 1/3 of global Jewry were wiped out. Not to make light of any of those things, but what's coming will be worse. 2/3 of the Jews in Israel, 2/3 will face the consequences of making a covenant with death. Having rejected the true Messiah, they will accept the false one. Walk down the high street in Golders Green. We want Mashiach now. Oh, they're going to get a Mashiach, all right. They're going to get the Anthropon Nomon, the man of lawlessness, Asara Mashiach, the Antichrist. Something terrible is going to happen. That's why God is letting this happen. It is the curse of the law. It is Leviticus 26, it is Deuteronomy 28. Why the Holocaust? Why the pogroms? Why the Spanish Inquisition? Read the book. The Mashiach will be a prophet like Moshe Rabbeinu. Deuteronomy 18. I will hold you accountable if you don't believe in him. The time of reckoning is coming. The Jews are back in the land. They are back in the temple. Something is taking shape on the Temple Mount as we speak, as we looked at this morning. Those prophecies of Revelation 11, the stage is being set, but they're not as obvious. What Daniel warned of, Hashikutza Meshomem, the abomination of desolation, it all adds up. It's all moving that way. It's moving that way quickly. I'm not an alarmist or a sensationalist, but I know what the scriptures say. Yes, we should defend Israel. Yes, as believers, we should stand with Israel and the Jews. But don't expect them to stand with you. Because when you tell them that their Messiah has come and he's their only hope, they're not going to like you too much either. How much do you love them? Do you love Israel enough to tell them the truth? Do you love the Arabs enough to tell them the truth? When you really love somebody, you accept the fact that they may not love you back. You love them because God loves them. Don't expect anything from them. But for the one here, and the one there, for that Jew, for that Arab, for that descendant of Abraham, who comes to faith in the promise of Abraham, it's worth it. I was in Israel a few weeks ago, witnessing to some young Israelis. They were all army guys. They were from Sayeret. They were from commando units. Sayeret Sanhanim and Sayeret Makar. They were special forces guys. I picked them up to the Yom Bareh and I was opening the scriptures and showing what happened with them. They never heard this from the rabbis. They never heard it. I was showing them about their own Messiah. They were listening keen. One of them's on the verge of getting saved. Please pray for him. Yes, we need to stand with Israel. But you can't stand with them if you don't tell them the truth. Don't get me wrong. When I see people who are trying to bless Israel without the gospel, they just think they have to support Zionism and God's going to... They may have good intention. But with no preacher, how shall they hear? We are told in Ezekiel and we're told in the book of Acts, I will require their blood of your hands. Oh yes, I support Zionism. I support the Jews. My family is Jewish. The best way to support the Jews is to tell them about their own Messiah. The best way to support Israel is to pray for the salvation of Israel and to support the evangelism of the Jews and the Arabs. That's the only thing going to save them. Yes, we need to refute these lies. Write this down. These are the lies you're hearing. These are the lies that need to be refuted. But these lies, and every one of these things is a myth. Every one of these lies disgusts me, turns my stomach. The hypocrisy, the outrage. It's beyond audacity. Every one of those lies bothers me. But there's another kind of lie that bothers me even more. That lie that there is some hope for Israel and the Jew without a saving faith in their Messiah. That lie that says he has not come, that Yeshua was not the one. I told the story this morning, if you weren't here. Something on the internet a few weeks ago by a Chabad rabbi from Operation Judaism. It's been on the internet for some months. And I watched what he was saying. And he was instructing young Jewish people, he was instructing young Orthodox Jews how to refute the quote-unquote missionaries' interpretation of Daniel 9, how to refute the Christians, how to refute the Messianic Jews, how to refute Daniel 9. And he said, now you see, if you count out these days from the time of Nebuchadnezzar's decree, as the Christians say, it would mean that Jesus died in 39 CE AD. Even the Christians themselves admit he died in 31, 32, 33. It couldn't possibly be. Every rabbi knows in a 19-year cycle there are 7 leap years with 2 months of a die, this year being one of them. When you take into account the leap years that every rabbi knows about, it comes out to 32 AD. Of course, he didn't tell them what it says in Yalkut about Daniel 9, where the ancient rabbis said the Messiah would have to exit by 33 AD. In other words, he lied. He lied. When the left-wing media lies against Israel and against the Zionists and against the Jews, I don't like it when the media lies against Israel and against the Jews. When left-wing academics lie against Israel and the Jews, I don't like it. When left-wing academics lie against Israel and against the Jews. When so-called Christian theologians lie against Israel and against the Jews, I don't like it when so-called Christians lie against Israel and against the Jews. But what do I do when rabbis lie against Israel and against the Jews? Before the Messiah, I am telling you the truth. It's the lie everybody agrees on. How can any Jew protest these lies when he's bought into a lie himself? They condemned Herzl. They condemned Ben-Gurion. They condemned Zionism. Of all the democracies in the world, only Israel denies Jews freedom of religion? How can you complain about anti-Semitism when you do that to your own people? Now look, don't get me wrong. I'm sickened and disgusted with people like Sizer, who will go to Iran, that is martyred 98% of its evangelical pastors. While Christians are on death row in Iran, he's on TV with them kicking Israel. As long as you hate Israel, you're his brother. Overlooking the fact that the ideology of Hezbollah and Hamas are identical virtually to ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram and Abu Sayyaf. Yes, it enrages me that they will turn their backs on the persecuted church in Saudi Arabia, in Iran, in Sudan. It enrages me that they will turn their back on persecuted Christians to befriend the Islam that's persecuting Christians in order to gang up on Israel. It enrages me. Israel has the best human rights record in the Middle East, the best women's rights record in the Middle East, the best Christian rights record in the Middle East. The best. Is it without fault? No, it is not. But it has the best record compared to the best of them. And compared to the others. This is undeniable. But it is also undeniable that the only democracy in the world denying Jews freedom of religion is Israel. That my son, my only son, volunteered to go to Israel, could have went to the legal court, but volunteered to fight in a combat brigade, while a yeshiva boy gets a subsidy to avoid the army. Is that freedom? Is that integrity? Is that democracy? Quite a thing. Quite a thing. I was talking to somebody this afternoon. You think of the Jewish intellectual, of the Jewish Nobel laureate. You think of the Jewish entrepreneur. And that is a relatively recent development since the Haskalah, since the Jewish Enlightenment. For centuries, Jewish learning and culture was controlled by rabbis. They were the people of the shtetl. If the rabbis had their way, when they did have their way, there was no Zionism. Now that there is an Israel, despite the rabbis' opposition, they want to control it. You only see the Jews having their day in overachievement since the Haskalah, since the rabbis lost their grip and control on Jewish culture and education. This is a fact. There's a lie. Yes, these lies must be refuted. And they aggravate me. I will refute any one of these lies. But there's a bigger lie still. That lie is that Yeshua is not the Messiah. The Messiah had to come and die before the second temple would be destroyed. The ancient sages admitted, Targum Yonatan, that Isaiah 53 is about the Messiah. In the synagogue liturgy, for Yomah, the Day of Atonement, Eliezer HaKalir put Isaiah 53 about the Messiah in the synagogue liturgy for Yom Kippur. You take any messianic prophecy, Rashi, the very Rashi who said Isaiah 53 is not about the Messiah, said that Zechariah 12, the look upon me who they had pierced is. Enough lies. Now let's look at the truth. I will pour it on the house of David, in verse 10 of Zechariah 12. On the house of David and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the spirit of grace and supplication, so they'll look upon me who they have pierced, and mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, and weep bitterly over him, like the bitter weeping over a firstborn. When your enemies tell you lies, it's very wrong. When you lie to yourself, it's a disaster. By the grace of God tonight, I've tried to tell you the truth about the lies the enemies of Zionism are telling about Israel. But by the grace of that same God of Israel, I've tried to tell you the truth about the lie most Jews are still telling themselves. Tony and myself will be here and talk to anybody who doesn't know Jesus as the Messiah. Brother Nissim is here, Tony's here, Andy's here. Please, please, if anything has touched you tonight and you don't know him as the Messiah, don't walk out that door without talking to us.